Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. This is season 14, and we're joined today by Professor Michelle R. Scott, who's professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She's the author of Blues Empress and Black Chattanooga, Bessie Smith in the Emerging Urban South, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2009. And she joins us today to talk about T.O.B.A time, Black Vaudeville, and the Theater Owners Booking Association in Jazz Age America, published this year by the University of Illinois Press. Allison Nadia Field writes of Professor Scott's book. Scott's meticulously researched and exquisitely detailed account reveals the broad impact of the T.O.B.A circuit and the complexities of its organization and operations. The discussions of individual performers, famous and obscure, and their experiences as they work this circuit are riveting. This is a benchmark book in theater studies and a definitive account of this fascinating institution. How are you doing today, Professor Scott?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to this book.
Yes, the journey was long and involved. It actually came right from the first book that you mentioned about Bessie Smith, Blues Empress and Black Chattanooga. So my first book was exploring Bessie Smith's life and her development of her musical consciousness in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where she was born, and exploring her early life before becoming the Blues Empress. I was really looking at the history of Black Chattanooga. And once I finally got to Bessie's role in being a public performer, I found out that she did a lot of headlining performances on T.O.B.A, or the Theater Owners Booking Association. And luckily for me, T.O.B.A was also one of the headquarters cities was in Chattanooga. So I'd already done a lot of the benchmark research for that location. And then in studying the other 100 theaters, I really moved my research and shifted it from looking at one individual entertainer to looking at the circuit, which served as a foundation for all of these entertainers in the 1920s and 30s.
When folks hear about Black performers in the late 19th and early 20th century, they immediately refer to the term the Chitlin Circuit. Mm-hmm. You're very clear early in the book that T.O.B.A was a very distinct aspect of Black entertainment and its presentation that cannot necessarily be collapsed into this idea of the Chitlin Circuit. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, when folks think of the Chitlin Circuit, they really are thinking of the early circuit of clubs that kind of crisscrossed the Deep South, where folks were playing literally for, sometimes dinner, sometimes, a couple of dollars, or the whole idea of having the leftovers, the chitlins, in terms of their exchange for their art. And a lot of those juke joints, backwoods clubs, even urban clubs, were part of T.O.B.A, but T.O.B.A was distinct in the fact that they were really more focused on having Black concert halls. And I put that in quotes because sometimes concert halls could be, 50 seats with a makeshift stage, but it was much more located in the neighborhoods as opposed to kind of like the backwoods juke joints. So the patterns of T.O.B.A in terms of how the theaters were connected were much more playing the theaters where blackface minstrel performers had performed just 2 decades before T.O.B.A got started. And then some of those theaters didn't get transferred over to the Chitlin Circuit. So it's kind of that midway gap between blackface minstrelsy and what would become early R&B, rock and roll, blues.
This is about the Black Vaudeville circuit. Could you explain to our watchers and listeners exactly what vaudeville was and what kind of innovations, for lack of a better way to describe it, did Black performers bring, to the vaudeville circuit?
Sure. So vaudeville as a genre is American live theater performance that connects anywhere between 10 to 20 acts that really have no particular theme or script. So you could have a dancer, you could have a blues belter, you could have a hula hoop twirler, an acrobat, an animal act, kids jumping rope, whatever you think of, you could have, kind of like America's Got Talent today, right? Yeah. Putting that all together in a large circuit. So mainstream vaudeville was one of the most popular forms of live entertainment in America between the 1880s all the way up to the 1930s. And African Americans could play in mainstream vaudeville. Mainstream vaudeville was primarily headquartered in New York. Things like the Keith Orpheum Circuit or our vaudeville circuits. But the issue was that since we're talking about nadir America, segregated America, within those 10 to 20 acts, acts, you might have 2 to 3 acts that might be African-American performers. And you had Black acts that crisscross circuit. So people like Sammy Davis Jr. might be on the Keith Orpheum circuit. People like Ethel Waters might be on the main circuit. But for the mainstay, if you're talking about the primary audiences of Black shows, which are working class Black folks, they needed their own circuit, their own theaters to come to them. They're not traveling to main cities like New York, but they will be in Dallas, they will be in Jackson, Mississippi. And T.O.B.A served that role for Black performers.
I remember as a young scholar reading about the Theater Booking Owners Association, the Theater Owners Booking Association, and reading quotes from performers who described it as being tough on Black asses.
Oh, yes.
Talk a little bit about some of the artists that you examine in the book and their experiences with T.O.B.A. One of the things that struck me is you describe what T.O.B.A was for many of these artists. It was a professional training ground. Yes. They weren't just performing for the sake of making a living. They clearly were doing that. But in many ways, they were furthering the culture because of the circuit.
Definitely. And so the circuit has many names and many interpretations. I think once I started doing the research, all I heard were the negative interpretations of the circuit. It was known for its gender discrimination on the circuit, its poor pay. If you weren't a headliner, you could be making $15 a week and still supposed to pay for your travel and lodging out of that, right? But when I started to get closer into the research and looking at people's lives, I realized that T.O.B.A was a mix. It wasn't just the story of white management exploiting Black artists. You had Black theater owners, Black managers, who are also a third of percent of the theaters that were represented on the circuits, were African Americans hiring their own, people who had been performers. And so you get this sense of the institution is much more complicated than folks like to think about it. But I heard every story from, people like Ethel Waters freely calling people out of their name because her contract was wrong or because she wasn't able to have the right tuning on her piano, to people like Thomas Dorsey, who was eventually the father of the gospel music, serving on the circuit as Georgia Tom and playing these very risque songs for Ma Rainey in the background. Sounds nothing like Precious Lord, right? So it was really this whole world unto itself where performers were training and learning and sharing with each other, but learning how to become artists at the same time.
You spoke a little bit about the gender discrimination on the circuit. What were some of the experiences of Black women as performers trying to manage their careers, on T.O.B.A?
The difficulty can really be seen in some of the blues headliners that performed. So the blues women, people like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Victoria Spivey, Sippy Wallace, are the ones who are leading the circuit in terms of their popularity. So most of the money that comes into the circuit is often due to these blues women performers. But their contracts, in comparison to looking at some of the contracts of the male headliners, were vastly different in terms of what they were supposed to get in a salary, how they were supposed to divide that salary up amongst their company, whereas a male headliner might just get a flat fee for himself. It was also difficult for women to travel. There was no real sense of protection or an idea of consent for young women. And we're saying women, but sometimes people are joining the circuit as young as 12 or 13, right? One of the main troupes that I kind of highlight as a photo in the book, the Effie Mae Moore troupe, when I show pictures of that, I'm like, this is a vaudevillian troupe. And people are like, those are little girls. I'm like, yes, they're little girls, often performing without a lot of protection. And so the risk of sexual assault was there, but also the risk of manipulation and not actually receiving the money they were duly owed rather, was a big part of the discrimination that you saw. Even the fact of where women performers could reside in terms of boarding houses. Boarding houses had clauses against, they didn't want to have wicked, quote unquote, wicked chorus girls living in their vicinity, right? They didn't want them to be tempting the male boarders in the house. So there was a lot of undue influence put upon women performers, and they're not really always receiving the reward.
You mentioned that when we hear the phrase tough on Black asses, right, it really does speak to our sense of the exploitation of Black culture by white business people. But as you talk about in the book, and really, it disrupts the narrative the way that you lay it out. A third of these businesses were owned by Black folks, who may also have been exploiting Black talent within that context. But a significant amount of these entrepreneurs were Jewish immigrants.
Yes.
And we can almost trace a line from that period of time to folks, running record companies like Atlantic and Chess Records, right? That ongoing relationship between Black cultural production and white companies, but specifically Jewish immigrant companies. Talk a little bit of what those dynamics were in the 1920s or before, particularly given the sense that, Jewish immigrants weren't in the mainstream either in that particular moment.
And to your last point, because those Jewish immigrants were not in the mainstream, there was a little bit more room for, surprisingly to me, looking at the documents, cordial relationships. So the main headquarters, the cities were Chattanooga, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And so in Chattanooga, you have Samuel Reven, who is a recent Jewish immigrant who runs that part of the Southern Circuit, which is part of the largest circuit. In Chicago, you have Martin Klein, who runs that particular circuit, and he's a first-generation Jewish immigrant. His family's been there for at least one generation. And then in the East Coast, you have S.H. Dudley, who had been a black-faced minstrel performer, an African-American who performed in blackface, who ran that circuit. And so their relationships in terms of how they shared profits, worked out tensions, you could really see in their business records, and a lot of business records are not as well preserved as I would have liked in my search. But what I found is that both groups, African American entrepreneurs and Jewish immigrants entrepreneurs, were quick to point out the discrimination they faced against native-born white entrepreneurs on the circuit, right? So the ethnic slurs went back and forth towards both groups. You find out a lot more about how they interacted well and negatively in Black newspapers, right? So before we can think of a thing called TMZ or any modern social media, all of their business was in the Black newspaper, right? To the point where you have some Black entrepreneurs saying, Black communities need to be more like Jewish communities. We need to unite and be tighter in how we process our business. To the point where you have Jewish entrepreneurs saying, we aren't the performers on this circuit, but we will gladly share the profits because you guys are doing the work, right? And then you have Southern native-born white male entrepreneurs who are like, this is just my money-making pit, and I don't care about either one of y'all. So it really depended on the city and where you were in terms of how those relationships worked.
This is a story about the development of Black culture as is the development of a Black business class. What were some of the reasons that, Black business owners may decide to become involved in this process of presenting Black music and Black art? I think about this as the same era, of course, in which we start to see the emergence of the Negro Leagues. In this moment. And it's, as you mentioned, it's a period that predates the Harlem Renaissance. And I do want to go back to that in a moment. But what were some of the inspirations for folks deciding to be involved in the business of presenting Black entertainment?
One of the things I discovered in researching just the very travel process of some of these performers, how they're getting from Chicago to St. Louis, down to Jackson, is that everything, because of the nature of segregation, had to be duplicated. And so you have entire communities which are creating Black businesses just to service the theater community. So the creation of Black women who are turning their homes into boarding houses, right? Or women who are acting as seamstresses who become costumers to folks on T.O.B.A. Or the pharmacies that only cater to people who have the odd hours of quote unquote theatrical people. And so you have this connection with Black business even outside of the theatrical profession. But you also have the building of theaters, I think of places like in Chicago or in Philadelphia, where that theater is going to hire not just the performers on the stage, but the people who do the lights, the people who move the scenery, the woman who's the cashier, and it's often a woman in front, the ushers, the folks who are basically setting up the communication between the local Black newspaper and the theater. So it was a creation of Black businesses that flourished as part of this connection to a live Black theater circuit.
One of the things that's also interesting about this history, this moment, in many ways, it is overshadowed by the Harlem Renaissance.
Mhm.
Um, and in many ways, that is the byproduct of folks who want to create an image of a high Black culture, i.e., the
Yes.
Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
and what we might think of as lowbrow
Hmm.
or even middle brow culture.
Right.
Talk a little bit about how everyday Black audiences perceive this version of the Chitlin Circuit
Hmm.
versus how they might have perceived the Harlem Renaissance, coming a decade later.
Yeah. It was very different. So in the sense that if you're thinking about the way that the theaters are covering the country, they're not located in New York City, which is the headquarters of white vaudeville, right? So they're
Hmm.
not even in the same spaces where the Harlem Renaissance would have flourished.
Hmm.
Um, their like highlight or highbrow city is Philadelphia. So something like the Standard Theater or the Dunbar Theater would be as high as you can go on Toba. Um, and a lot of it had to do with like reading how audiences interpreted the acts. That if you go to a Toba show, it's similar to some of the independent Black theater shows that we go to today. They talked about audiences talking to each other. It was like a campground meeting, right? And they're freely eating as the performance goes on.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
not the place where you wear your necessarily your Sunday's best and you go and you hear high art of the jazz that's being created, right? Not that that music is not being performed there. It's just that the spaces are a little bit different in terms of who's welcomed there. You have working class Black folks who go to Toba performances because they see themselves on stage, right? They are a feather boa and a sequin skirt removed from being a Bessie Smith themselves. And so, because they could see themselves in these spaces, it meant that it was a culture that was open to everyone. It wasn't just the highbrow or elite or the middle brow.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
anybody could be that hula hooper, right? Anybody could aspire to be that, that dancer third from the left in the chorus, right? So you could see a hope and a vision for yourself, regardless of class within the Black community on Toba.
For yourself as a historian, what were some of the
Mhm.
challenges that you faced going into the archive trying to pull this story together?
I think the biggest challenge is that, well, first it was the perception that, oh, it must be so fun because you work on Black music and art and theater. Um, and it's wonderful. I love it. It's what I do. I perform, I sing, and I love to read and research about it. But there's no archive
Yeah.
for a lot of this information. I found Toba business records in one library in Macon, Georgia, and it was 4 boxes of saved contracts. Very grateful to find those. But I'm sifting through scrapbooks. I'm looking at ephemera, advertisement, program bills,
Yeah.
notices in the newspaper to see when this theater was sold, how much it sold for, is it in probate, a lot of financial records. So I really kind of had to train myself in a new field of business history that was not my thing coming from the Bessie Smith book. And so I think just trying to piece all of these things together, it was really like a treasure hunt, but it was difficult. It wasn't just, oh, let's go and be immersed by the sounds of blues. It was like, I got to figure out how did they get to that theater and who was the instrumentalist? How did they find a saxophone player? And what would that person have been paid? Where do they live? A lot of the background questions that folks kind of take for granted that are in the background when people just appear on stage. There are hundreds of people working in the
Yeah.
background to get them to that moment on stage.
Right. What was one of the biggest surprises you came across in doing this research?
Biggest surprises. One, the involvement of Black women as owners and managers of some of these
Yeah.
theaters, I think was huge for me. It started out with looking at some of the early precursors to the circuit. I did some work on the main Black founder, Sherman Dudley, and found that he was having correspondence with these 2 Black vaudevillian women, Emma and Mabel Griffin, who were also based in Chicago at the same time that he was there. It turned out that they left vaudeville as performers and started leasing theaters on their own, and were really economic Black nationalists and how they thought this should be an all Black circuit. We don't need the help from any other immigrant group. It needs to be us. So finding their involvement, but then also finding that the major theater that was destroyed by the Tulsa Massacre, the Dreamland Theater,
Mm-hmm.
was also owned by an African American woman who owned 3 other circuits on the theater. So finding the gender inequities of the artists were one thing, but then the authority and somewhat the autonomy that the managers and entrepreneurs had behind the scenes was very surprising to me.
Was there a story that you came across that, for whatever reason, you weren't able to include in the book?
Oh, many stories. A lot of the personal stories of the artists were gained through oral histories that are being collected at the Smithsonian Jazz Oral Histories. And they did a slew of tapes and recordings with musicians, but they also did some with comedians and dancers. And I think some of the most heartfelt stories were the ones about performers who did not make it into the circuit for whatever reason, or who were cast out by their families once they decided to choose the secular over the sacred. And there were many stories like that, or just the level of violence that some of these young girls went through, which I allude to in some cases, but in some other cases, I get the sense that I'm listening on these interviews that have been done maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I didn't feel like that was my story to tell without their consent. So, yeah.
It's interesting. The story of the Theater Owners Booking Association really comes to a close because of the emergence of new technologies.
Yes.
Specifically the film industry. Talk about what the film industry did, to this independent circuit of Black, venue owners who are presenting Black culture, in the 1920s.
So when sound film comes in and starts to reach a height around 1927 or 1928, with films like The Jazz Singer, for example, what folks had gone to as audience members to experience in live theater, they thought would be replicated by film. And in the first couple of years of sound film, you have theaters that showcase both, right? So you would have the silent film that would precede the live vaudeville performance. But then when silent film was no longer silent, you didn't necessarily need that introduction anymore, So you had entertainers who were made their own switch. So they had been on vaudeville stages. And then they start to join early film, both silent and sound. So people like Victoria Spivey were there. Bessie Smith made an early film. And so they're kind of testing the waters. But then you also have T.O.B.A entrepreneurs like S.H. Dudley, who was like, okay, this film thing is about to take off. And he invests in early race film companies, kind of knowing that vaudeville is going to be left behind. And so the whole industry as a whole, mainstream vaudeville and Black Vaudeville, is coming to a close by the time you get to the 1930s. But those performers don't stop their energies, right? So they then move on to Broadway, or they move on to cabarets or concerts. And a lot of them move into becoming character actors in early Black film.
When you think of that era and make comparisons to this moment, is there any example you can think of in a contemporary moment that captures the essence of what this moment was, for Black artists and Black theater owners?
I really think of the mix of someone like a Tyler Perry figure having those early plays where he's promoting himself out of the car, right? And then you go from theater to theater, and then he's eventually owning his own studio, right? But then I also think about the concerts that we just saw this summer in terms of like the Renaissance tour, that you don't think of how many people and artists like that, like Beyonce, employs to have a nightly show, and how this show is crisscrossing the country. And I think what I wanted to capture most about T.O.B.A is that it wasn't just about the artist, it was about a communal movement of Black people trying to express Black artistic excellence in every way they could, from that lighting tech, from that person who's in the orchestra pit, from the person who's running off, the photocopies of it eventually, or the dittos of what would be the program bill. And so that if we can see how much effort it takes to do that now in the 21st century, that it's not a single effort, and just how the audiences receive a performance like that, right? It becomes a cultural moment, a cultural event. And that's what T.O.B.A shows were like. They were a cultural moment, a cultural event. You didn't want to miss the latest Ma Rainey show if you could. So.
Yeah. What's to be said to contemporary audiences about what the ultimate value of Black vaudeville was?
I would say that the ultimate value of Black Vaudeville is it really served as the foundation for live Black theater performance or live Black entertainment. That in order to understand where we are now in terms of hip hop or earlier R&B or rock or blues, you have to understand the foundations about how those performers from the 19th century, just a generation removed from enslavement, were able to see themselves in a light that was different than the society they lived in, right? And so that you could see that it wasn't just a scenario of other people exploiting Black art for their own, needs, that Black people were often the architects of their own artistic story.
You mentioned that your book Blues Empress in Black Chattanooga kind of opened up the opportunity for the T.O.B.A book.
It did.
What did the T.O.B.A book open up for you in terms of a next project?
The T.O.B.A book is actually going to take me a little bit out of the 1920s. And so since this book just came out and I'm in the middle of doing what I'm doing right now, it's getting it all over and talking about it. I haven't really sat down in the archives, which is my happy place to be with all of that. That's my happy place. But I'm thinking about, I was looking at some research on Count Basie, who got his start in some of these early T.O.B.A theaters. And then I saw a documentary in the middle of the pandemic, and as we watched everything in the world during the pandemic, that talked about his home life and his wife, Catherine Basie, who was a burlesque dancer at the same time that he was an early musician. And I wanted to move my research a little bit into the 40s, 50s, and 60s and go back to my roots of being a women's historian and look at Black women's agency, also behind the scenes, but behind the scenes of early R&B as opposed to this vaudeville movement. So I'm branching away from the 20s, as hard as that may be.
We've been joined today by Professor Michelle R. Scott, who's Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She's the author of Blues Empress in Black Chattanooga, Bessie Smith in the Emerging Urban South, published University of Illinois Press, 2009. She joined us today to talk about T.O.B.A time, Black Vaudeville, and the Theater Owners Booking Association in Jazz Age America, published this year by the University of Illinois Press. Thank you for joining us, Professor Scott.
Thank you so much for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every Black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All Black everything, everything Black, culture over everything.